You miserable son of a bitch. I gave you my heart, I gave you my soul, I gave you my body, and you just threw me aside like I was some piece of garbage.
Yeah, my bad.
A grand piano falls out of a clear sky and crushes a man on a doorstep. That's it. That's the last image American audiences ever got of Charlie Harper, the character who built one of the biggest sitcoms of the 2000s and then, in real life, nearly burned the whole production to the ground. To understand why a network comedy chose to end its 12-year run by literally dropping a piece of furniture on its own leading man, you have to go back to a bar conversation in Los Angeles, a firing that shocked Hollywood, and a public breakdown that turned into a national spectacle. This is the story of how 2.5 Men became appointment television, how its biggest star turned into its biggest liability, and how the show's creator got the very last word. Every sitcom origin story sounds a little too neat in hindsight, but this one really did start with a conversation over drinks. Producer Chuck Lorre was talking with a friend who was newly divorced and raising a son while crashing with his brother. Lorre saw a show in it immediately, a fractured family forced under one roof, built for comedy but grounded in something real. The first pitch to CBS wasn't the version that aired. Lorre and his writing partner floated a setup involving a single father, his gay brother, and a straight son, a structure the network worried was too much for a mainstream 9 p.m. slot in the early 2000s. CBS pushed for something safer, and the writers reshaped it into the trio audiences would come to know: a womanizing jingle writer, his uptight, recently divorced chiropractor brother, and the brother's young son, all living together in a beach house in Malibu. Even after the concept was locked, the show almost didn't make it to air. The budget CBS was staring at, over $1 million an episode, was steep for a single-camera-era network trying to justify a traditional multi-camera comedy. Lorre took a pay cut himself and renegotiated with the cast to bring the number down, and the green light finally came through just weeks before filming was scheduled to begin. The beach house itself was modeled on Lorre's actual home, rebuilt on a soundstage down to small details. Even the show's theme song was something Lorre wrote himself in less than an hour, right before the cameras started rolling. Casting was its own chaos. The lead role almost went to a different well-known television actor who passed on it. When Charlie Sheen's name came up, he wasn't sold either. Lorre reportedly spent the better part of a day at Sheen's house convincing him to commit to series television, something Sheen had avoided for years. The actor who eventually played the uptight brother had actually first read for Sheen's role and was deemed a poor match, too likable to play a womanizer. And the kid who became the half-man of the title, a young Angus T. Jones, was one of the last children to audition, and nearly lost the role after a growth spurt right before filming started. None of this suggested a show destined to become one of the most watched comedies in America. But it did. 2.5 Men premiered in September 2003 to solid but unspectacular ratings and reviews that leaned dismissive. Critics called it broad, formulaic, easy. Audiences disagreed almost immediately. Within a few episodes, the numbers were climbing, and by the end of its first season the show had cracked the top 10 in the country. CBS noticed something else too. The audience skewed heavily female, which wasn't the assumption going in, and the network adjusted its marketing to chase that crowd more aggressively. The show didn't just grow domestically. It found international syndication fast, airing in dozens of countries within its first couple of years, and its German premiere reportedly pulled in one of the largest audiences an American sitcom had ever drawn there. By its third season, 2.5 Men wasn't just a hit, it was CBS's top comedy, regularly pulling in well over 15 million viewers a week, numbers that made its ad slots some of the most expensive real estate on network television. That kind of popularity bled into pop culture in strange, specific ways. Alan Harper's profession reportedly correlated with a bump in chiropractic school enrollment. Charlie's loud bowling shirts became a genuine retail trend. The show's writing staff, meanwhile, was working brutal hours to keep up with a hit that had outgrown everyone's expectations, and at least one producer was hospitalized during a particularly grueling stretch of the second season. At the center of it all was Charlie Sheen, playing a character who was, by design, barely a stretch from his own tabloid reputation, a hard-drinking, commitment-phobic bachelor who never seemed to face consequences. Audiences loved the wink of it. The character was flawed and selfish, but there was something aspirational in the chaos, and Sheen's easy charisma made it land as funny rather than grim. 4 years, that overlap between actor and role was the show's secret weapon. Eventually, it became its undoing. By 2010, 2.5 Men had been a top-rated comedy for the better part of a decade, and Sheen had become, by a wide margin, the highest-paid actor in television, reportedly earning close to $1 million an episode already. When his contract came up for renewal, he didn't ask for a modest raise. He asked for roughly double what he was making, a number that stunned executives at CBS and Warner Brothers, the studio producing the show. Negotiations dragged for weeks, reportedly continuing even during unrelated events like televised sports games, as both sides tried to find a number that worked. Eventually Sheen got close to what he wanted, a deal that made him, briefly, the best-paid actor on American television. What made the number so uncomfortable in retrospect is what had happened only months earlier. Sheen had been arrested on domestic violence charges over the previous holiday season. The studio negotiated the record contract anyway, largely because the show's entire commercial identity was built around him, and nobody wanted to test whether the franchise could survive without its lead. It couldn't survive what came next, but not because of a ratings problem. Sheen's history with substance abuse stretched back over a decade before the meltdown that ended his run on the show. He had gone through rehab as far back as the late 1990s. But the trouble that finally cracked the show open started building visibly in 2009 and 2010. A Christmas Day arrest for an altercation with his then-wife, a trashed hotel room in New York that made headlines and cost thousands in damages, another stint in treatment. Behind the scenes, cast and crew have described a set that was increasingly unpredictable. Episodes where Sheen reportedly arrived unable to remember lines, and clashes with Chuck Lorre over scripts that Sheen felt didn't reflect who he was anymore. By January 2011, the studio made the call to shut down production entirely so Sheen could get treatment. Instead of using the pause to recover quietly, Sheen went in the opposite direction. Reports of an extended chaotic party at his home ended with a hospital visit, and rather than downplaying it afterward, Sheen leaned into the spectacle, telling reporters he'd essentially willed himself back to health through sheer force of mind. Then came the interviews. Over the following weeks, Sheen gave a series of increasingly bizarre, wildly quotable media appearances. He referred to himself using phrases that instantly became internet shorthand, talk of tiger blood, of not being like ordinary people, of having a kind of superhuman resilience. He publicly and personally attacked Chuck Lorre using language many considered offensive, including a reference to Lorre's heritage that drew significant backlash. He bragged openly about drug use in terms that were shocking even by celebrity scandal standards. Whatever the intent behind it, the material was endlessly repeatable. Clips circulated everywhere, catchphrases spread across headlines and t-shirts, and Sheen became, briefly, one of the most talked about people in the country for reasons that had nothing to do with acting. When he joined Twitter that spring, he broke a record by picking up 1 million followers within a single day, an audience showing up less out of admiration and more out of morbid curiosity about what he'd say next. CBS and Warner Brothers didn't wait long to act. In early March 2011, they fired him from the show he'd built his career on. The studio's explanation, laid out in a lengthy formal letter, described behavior it called dangerous and out of control, cited the attacks on Lorre, and even raised concerns about legal exposure connected to his drug use. It cost the production the rest of that season, roughly 8 unfilmed episodes and an estimated $10 million loss, and put around 200 crew members' jobs in immediate jeopardy. For a studio that had just handed the same actor the richest deal in television history a year earlier, it was a remarkable reversal, choosing to walk away from its own most bankable star rather than keep absorbing the risk. Sheen didn't go quietly. Within days he filed a lawsuit against Warner Brothers and Lorre seeking roughly $100 million, arguing the firing was unjustified and that he'd been made a scapegoat. The fight over where the case would even be heard took months, with the studio insisting on arbitration rather than a public jury trial. By that fall, the two sides had reached a private settlement, one that was never fully disclosed but was widely reported to be worth well over $100 million once back-end profit participation was factored in. The show's most bankable star was gone. The show itself was still under contract to keep going. Replacing the highest-paid actor on television mid-scandal with a hit show's future on the line is not a normal casting problem. CBS reportedly got close to signing a well-known British leading man for the role before he walked away from the deal just days before the network's big advertiser presentation, citing creative differences. That left the studio scrambling with almost no time to find someone else. Ashton Kutcher's name entered the conversation days later, and the deal came together fast, a one-season commitment worth a fraction of what Sheen had been making, but still one of the larger contracts in the medium at the time. The show announced the casting right before its presentation to advertisers, just in time to steady a very nervous room. Kutcher's debut episode drew a massive audience curious to see how the show would handle the transition, and the writers didn't shy away from the obvious. The episode opened with Charlie Harper's funeral, explaining his death with the same dark, glib humor the show had always traded in, and introduced Kutcher's character, a heartbroken tech billionaire, arriving at the same beach house under very different circumstances. Where Charlie had been effortlessly confident, the new character was awkward, freshly divorced, and emotionally raw, different enough that comparisons to Sheen's version were almost beside the point. The new dynamic quietly reshuffled the whole show. Alan Harper, once the show's perpetual screw-up, became something closer to a mentor figure to the new roommate, which gave the veteran actor playing him fresh material after nearly a decade in the same groove. Meanwhile, the character who had aged up the least gracefully in real life, the show's young Jake Harper, found himself with less and less to do. Angus T. Jones had been part of the show since he was 10 years old, growing up almost entirely on that soundstage. For a long stretch, it looked like a dream job: massive visibility, a career most child actors would envy, and a paycheck that reportedly reached hundreds of thousands of dollars per episode by his final seasons. But the older he got, the more uneasy he became with the material itself. The show's steady diet of jokes about sex, drinking, and casual hookups sat increasingly badly with him as his personal beliefs shifted. That shift became public in 2012, when Jones appeared in a video produced by a religious organization and told viewers, in blunt terms, that the show he starred on wasn't good for them and that they should stop watching. He described feeling like a hypocrite showing up to work on something he no longer believed in. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment comment. By his own later account, he'd been wrestling with the disconnect for years, quietly asking writers to trim scenes he found objectionable and growing noticeably more withdrawn on set. The reaction split cleanly. Some people respected a young man taking a public stand rooted in genuine conviction. A lot of Hollywood, and a lot of the show's fanbase, saw it as biting the hand that had made him famous and wealthy. Jones apologized fairly quickly for how the comments landed with his castmates, but he didn't walk back the substance of what he'd said. The relationships on set didn't fully recover. Within a year, the show confirmed he'd be stepping back from the role entirely, and he was absent for the whole of the final season, except for one last appearance. He came back for the series finale, playing a grown-up version of Jake who'd turned an early investment from his uncle into real money, closing the loop on the character in a way the writers clearly intended as a wink to longtime viewers before the show said goodbye for good. CBS spent months building anticipation for the finale, giving it a title that hinted heavily at what was coming, Of Course He's Dead, without confirming whether Sheen's character would actually reappear. The cast played coy in interviews. One of the stars went on a late-night talk show days before the finale and promised viewers would be shocked, which only fueled speculation. The second-to-last episode ended on a deliberate cliffhanger, with a mysterious package addressed to Charlie Harper, and the resulting online chatter helped push the finale into serious trending territory before it even aired. Sheen added to the noise himself, publicly joking the day before broadcast that people shouldn't expect to see him, a comment that could have been read as a straight denial or as exactly the kind of misdirection you'd expect from a finale built on secrecy. The production kept the actual script locked down tight. Even members of the cast reportedly didn't get full pages, and guest performers were only given the specific lines relevant to their scenes. When the episode finally aired in February 2015, more than 13 million people were watching. And after 12 seasons of build-up, the show gave its answer in about 15 seconds. A man resembling Charlie Harper approached the old beach house and rang the doorbell. Before anyone answered, a full-size grand piano dropped out of nowhere and crushed him on the spot. Then the camera pulled back to reveal Chuck Lorre himself, sitting in a director's chair, looking straight into the lens. He delivered one of Sheen's own signature lines back at the audience, a single word that had defined the actor's public meltdown 4 years earlier, and then a second piano fell and crushed him too. It was audacious, a little mean, and unmistakably personal. Whatever else people took from that closing image, nobody watching missed who it was aimed at. Chuck Lorre, the man Sheen had spent a radio interview calling names on national media, had waited 4 years and gotten the literal last word, and the last laugh, on the finale of the show that made them both famous. Reactions split almost immediately, and it didn't really settle in the years after. A large chunk of viewers thought the bit was exactly the kind of dark, self-aware humor the show had always leaned on, and appreciated that the writers didn't pretend the Sheen chapter hadn't happened. A comparable chunk thought it read as petty, a producer using his own finale to take a public swing at a former star, in front of an audience that hadn't necessarily signed up to watch a personal grudge play out on screen. Entertainment outlets and social media ran with it for days afterward, and the scene became, by a wide margin, the most discussed moment of the show's entire run. more talked about than any single episode from its actual ratings peak years earlier. Sheen, for his part, seemed to take it in stride publicly. Asked about it not long after the finale aired, he called the gag silly but said he was, in a strange way, honored by it, a fairly gracious response given how directly the joke targeted him. The cast scattered into very different second acts. Sheen tried to rebuild with a new FX comedy that ran for 2 seasons but never approached his old numbers, and in 2015 he disclosed publicly that he was HIV positive, adding another layer to a rebuilding process that's still ongoing. A guest spot on a later Chuck Lorre project years afterward suggested at least a partial professional thaw between the two men, even if the relationship never went back to what it was. Jon Cryer, who spent all 12 seasons playing Alan, ended up with arguably the steadiest post-show career of the group, a couple of Emmy wins, a run playing a well-known comic book villain, and a lead role in a new network sitcom picked up nearly a decade after the original series ended. Ashton Kutcher parlayed his 4 seasons into a successful Netflix comedy and a growing profile as a tech investor, and later returned to one of his earlier, more beloved roles in a streaming revival. Angus T. Jones stepped almost entirely away from acting, finished a college degree, and has mostly stayed out of the spotlight since, resurfacing only occasionally and briefly. Looking back years later, Sheen has been notably more reflective about the whole saga than he was in the moment, acknowledging in interviews that he mishandled the situation badly and that the salary fight and the meltdown that followed were connected, part of the same downward spiral. It's a strikingly different tone from the man who was calling himself unbeatable on live television in 2011. 2.5 Men isn't remembered today purely for its jokes or its ratings, impressive as those were at their peak. It's remembered for what happened around it, a lead actor's public collapse playing out in real time on national television, a studio choosing to fire its own cash cow rather than keep absorbing the risk, and a finale that turned the entire mess into one last, pointed punchline instead of pretending it never happened. A reboot gets floated occasionally, and it's easy to see why the idea keeps resurfacing. The brand recognition alone is enormous. But the practical obstacles are real. The show's central comedic engine, built heavily around Charlie's unapologetic womanizing, would need serious retooling to land with today's audiences. The people involved have all moved into different chapters of their careers and, in at least one case, different values entirely. And after an ending as final and as pointed as 2 pianos falling from the sky, it's hard to imagine any version of a comeback that wouldn't feel like it was working against its own best joke. 12 seasons, one of the most expensive contracts in TV history, a very public unraveling, and a finale that settled the score in 15 seconds flat. That's the story CBS's biggest sitcom of the 2000s